Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, or good evening if you're in the UK. We're here to talk to Sarah Penner about her new novel, The London Seance Society. And we're also, I'm pleased to say, going to be introducing you to Susan Stokes-Chapman, and the only copy we currently have of Pandora, because I keep hand selling it to everybody. Ian is holding it up, and it is a paperback original here in the United States. Susan lives in the UK. And I'm delighted that when I was reading Susan's book in the acknowledgement, she spoke about Sarah and how much help Sarah had been. So I thought I'll ask Sarah if she would be all right if Susan joins us, and Sarah was delighted. So here we all are. Right. Thank you, Ian, very much. So, ladies, I hoping that you'll mostly talk to each other, but Sarah sent some, I thought, excellent questions that I'm interested in, and then I'll sort of fade away here and let you talk. But why is it that you both are so interested in writing British historical fiction? And you're not quite in the same time, but sort of close. Was The Lost Apothecary Georgian? I can't remember, Sarah.
Yeah, it was The Lost Apothecary's historical narrative takes place in 1791, which is Georgian London. And that's actually, I believe, how Susan and I first became connected, was on Twitter. She had posted something to the effect of, does anybody else find themselves enamored of Georgian London? And I think I said yes. And then we started following each other. And it's been really interesting because we kind of became critique partners. And when we first started interacting, neither of us were agented, and then we both got agents, and then we both got book deals. And it's so funny that just that simple tweet connected us. And then when I was in London last year for the paperback release of The Lost Apothecary, she was able to attend a garden party hosted by my publisher. So we were able to meet in person, and it's just really interesting how the virtual world can bring people together, and apparently Georgian London too.
Yeah, I mean, we first connected, I think you said it must have been, 6-7 years ago. So that's how long the connection has been around. And obviously Sarah and I, as she's just said, we were both writing fiction in the Georgian era, but actually we were both writing novels which we have since had to shelve. And yeah, we've kind of just been on this journey together. Sarah a little bit first, a bit before me, but I'm following closely behind. And yeah, we've had pretty similar stories, I think, haven't we?
Yeah, and we've both read each other's unpublished manuscript. And that's kind of that's what critique partners find themselves doing, is you get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we both have a shelved manuscript that was never agented, never published. And then of course we've both read each other's debuts. So it's funny how it all has worked out.
Yeah.
One of the things I love Georgian London, which has a very long sweep. Excuse me. I was just looking up David Liss's first book to see. It is A Conspiracy of Paper, was the rare historical that won an Edgar Award when it came out. And it's basically about the South Sea bubble. So it is at the earlier part of the 18th century. You both are writing in the later part of the 18th century. So much historical is either Victorian or Regency. And people get Regency all wrong because they think it's actually late Georgian, all the way. So why Georgian in particular? What is there about the late 18th century that really fires you up?
Well, for The Lost Apothecary... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to say, who wants to take this first? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I'll take it first. I had a very specific time frame I needed to fall in front of, because my book, The Lost Apothecary, is about disguised poison and women using poison against the men who have wronged them. And in the 1850s is when we began to see the advent of forensic toxicology and the ability to detect poison during an autopsy. So I absolutely had to stay in front of that time frame.
Right.
So I knew I needed to be either in the first half of the 1800s, but I thought that there was something so kind of enchanting about going back a little bit further. And Georgian London is so, like you said, Barbara, we don't see that era a lot in commercial fiction, at least in the US, and I think the UK as well. And so it kind of feels untapped, and yet it was such an interesting era in terms of everything from police corruption. I mean, it was pre-industrial revolution. There was the gin craze. We had sort of a crazy king sitting on the throne, King George III. So I always just felt like it was so interesting, and brothels everywhere, and just a time in London's history that we haven't seen a lot of fiction take place. And then, of course, like I said, it worked really well for an apothecary who needs to get away with her sinister behavior. So that's why I chose Georgian London, but definitely want to hear Susan's thoughts as well.
Well, mine comes from very young age, really. So the initial obsession started when I was about 9 or 10, and I saw the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in 1995. And obviously back then I was a kid. I didn't get any of the more troublesome themes that were kind of going along underneath. All I saw at that point was the romance and the beauty of it, and oh, how romantic and how lovely, and fans and balls and all that kind of thing. But it is the thing that actually got me researching the era. So it must have been around 14 or 15 that I was really heavily kind of reading historical fiction, whether it was a corset ripper or something a little bit more staid and a bit more realistic. But I just became completely immersed in the era. I'm also born and bred in Lichfield in Staffordshire, and that's the home city of Dr. Johnson, who wrote the first English dictionary. So I've always had a kind of subconscious link, I think, to the era anyway. But I studied a lot of Romanticism modules at university. So that's covering the poets, Keats and Byron and Shelley. My first shelved novel was inspired by one of these modules. And I won't go into massive details here, but it was essentially it was the female voice of a real life love affair, essentially, by the journalist William Hazlitt. And the reason I suppose I chose Georgian London for my novel is partly because I didn't want to waste so much of the research that I'd already done on this first novel, because I spent an unhealthy amount of time on this novel. It must have been, not writing it for 10 years, but from the kind of original idea to the research, the writing to the final rejection, that was a 10-year sort of gap. And I didn't want to waste any of that research. There was such a lot there, and I thought I need to use this somehow. But my own novel, it is a loose reinterpretation of the Greek myth Pandora's box, set in the antiquity scene. And one of the big questions I'm often asked is, why Greek myth, and why put it into Georgian London? It seems such an odd sort of thing to do. But my answer is actually, well, no, because the Georgians were fascinated by the ancient world. They spent a lot of time abroad themselves. So many of the aristocrats would go on the grand tour, and they would bring a lot of that inspiration of the old world back, and it would go into their architecture, and it would go into their jewelry designs. I could do a whole essay on this, and I'm not going to, but I think the key point I want to make here is that the antiquity scene was a big thing for them. So the excavation of Pompeii was in the late 1700s, so that was still quite fresh. And many pieces of antiquity, such as vases, for instance, were brought over to the UK. And one avid collector, who is actually a main character in my novel, was William Hamilton. And he had a vast collection of Greek antiquity, vases, Greek vases in particular. And I just found that interesting in the way that I could potentially use the idea of Pandora's box and the fact historically it was never a box to begin with, but it was actually a vase. I thought I can link these two. And there was a shipwreck, and that was an historic fact, and I thought I can use this. And so 1799, I had to use that particular year because that was the year the HMS Colossus sank, which happened to have on board a lot of William Hamilton's collection. And so, yeah, in that sense, A, I didn't want to waste the research I'd done for book one, and B, the year, as Sarah said, it matched what I was trying to do with the story.
So I came to your book, I have to admit, because I have a lifelong fascination with Wedgwood, Josiah Wedgwood, who actually began his pottery in the middle of the 18th century and laid the groundwork for a lot of the British Industrial Revolution by digging canals, because pottery, or sponsoring canals, because pottery was fragile, and it floated down to market a lot better than it traveled. And I have a book over here called The Radical Potter, which I keep trying to find moments in between Zoom events when I could actually read it. So you're based because Wedgwood actually recreated a number of, antique vases. Really got me going. But the other thing I loved about your book is, and I don't know if either of you are familiar with the late Elizabeth Peters, who was actually Barbara Michaels, who was actually Barbara Mertz, and she was an Egyptian, actually a PhD Egyptologist, and wrote an amazing series about Amelia Peabody, who was a 19th century Victorian lady. I don't want to say they're mystery, they're rom-com, they're all sorts of things. One of the best-selling series you can imagine. And there were many things in Pandora that reminded me of Elizabeth Peters' work, which I recommend to you, starting with the crocodile and the sandbags. So we have a huge customer base for Elizabeth Peters. So I have been telling people that Pandora is the book you want to read.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, there's lots of similar things, but we should really, this was, after all, Sarah's.
It is.
Event here.
Star of the show.
Right. So since, Susan, you haven't thoroughly read the London Seance Society, Sarah, why don't we talk about that for a minute, and then you and Susan can chat. I loved The Lost Apothecary. We had a great conversation, if I remember right. Unfortunately, also on Zoom, but I'm still hoping to get Sarah to Scottsdale one of these days. What interested you in jumping a century almost, 1873? Was it the whole Victorian thing about spiritualism that, which was true in not just in England, but in all over? And why do you think it was such a thing in the 19th century?
Right. It's funny because when we started this call, Barbara, you said that most or a lot of historical fiction, particularly set in London, takes place in not in the Georgian era, but in the Victorian or Regency eras. And I remember when I wrote and published The Lost Apothecary, kind of using that as something to kind of not brag about, but I would share that I avoided the Victorian era, and this is set in Georgian London. And then, of course, my second book, I wanted to write a ghost story. I've always wanted to write a ghost story. I knew I wanted it to take place in London, and you cannot take those two elements together, a ghost story in London, and avoid the Victorian era, because the Victorians were enamored of the spirit world and the paranormal, and the wealthy were having parlor room seances every week for their rich friends. And so I knew if I'm going to tell a story in which seances take a central role, this needs to be set in the Victorian era. So I chose 1873. And the book is about a woman named Vaudeline. And she's known internationally for her skill in the art of seance, particularly her ability to conjure the spirits of murder victims to ascertain the identity of the people who killed them. And she gets a knock on her door from a young woman named Lina, who's the story's protagonist. And Lina is from London, and she has lost her sister under suspicious circumstances. And the police are really giving the murder case no attention whatsoever. And Lina is like me. She's a skeptic. She doesn't necessarily believe in the spirit world. And she wants to figure out what happened to her little sister. So she chooses to set that skepticism aside and seek out Vaudeline's help in hopefully conjuring her sister's spirit to solve this murder case. So it's been described as a Gothic whodunit, which I think is very appropriate. And I really enjoyed digging into some of the lesser known customs and rituals that the Victorians held around death and dying. I mean, we all know about our traditions that still exist today to wear dark colors to funerals, but if you look back at the Victorians, they actually had very rigid, strict practices, even going so far as the width of the silk band around a man's top hat. If he was attending the funeral services of someone that was a distant cousin, that width may be just a couple of centimeters. But if it was a spouse or a child, that band could be up to 7 inches high. So their rules were much more strict and rigid than what we see today. Another kind of morbid example is this tradition that we still have of sending flowers to a funeral home. That originated because we didn't have the technology and the science to embalm bodies. And so the Victorians would surround the casket with flowers in order to mask the odor of the body. So the book is full of really interesting tidbits that I learned. Households in mourning, they would stop their clocks at the time that the deceased died. Any photos of the deceased person, they would turn face down. There's all sorts of things. And in the back of the book, one of the pieces of the book that a lot of early readers have enjoyed is kind of not a comprehensive, but a fairly substantial list of Victorian mourning traditions in the back of the book. So but I'm so glad that that's the era that I chose for this book. I think it was the right approach. I think that Victorian fiction is popular for a reason. And I really tried to sort of take a fresh approach to it. And I can't imagine having said it in any other era.
No, I don't think you could. I mean, mourning jewelry, and hair and all the rest. There were a lot of weird things. The Costume Institute at the Met did a really great show on Victorian mourning sometime before the pandemic. I don't remember exactly where. They even talked about how you graduate from deep black to gray and then lighter gray, and then you could wear violet, that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a huge deal. This may seem far out to you, but I've often thought about this. And Susan, the drug of choice really in the Elizabethan, certainly into the 18th century, was alcohol, especially the 18th century where they were swigging gin, Blue Rune from Holland and so forth. But in the 19th century, and probably partly because of India and Afghanistan, there was a lot of opium use. And, which one is it? The opium eater? I can't remember. Was it Macaulay? No.
I'm not
anyway,
sure.
And so I sort of wondered. Sorry?
I was just thinking that the name was on the tip of my tongue and it's just completely gone out of my head.
Thomas somebody, it'll come to me. There's that wonderful trilogy by David Morrell about the guy who was the opium eater, and in between in sober moments he solved crimes. But anyway, my point was that I'm wondering because, if you're drunk, you're just drunk. But if you're on drugs, there's an altered state thing going on. And I wondered if some of this interest, in seance and the supernatural and all the rest of it was partly because, people had begun to experience drugs.
That's an interesting theory. I mean, if you kind of reverse back a few years and you look at where did this idea of spiritualism really originated, it actually originated on the East Coast of the United States with these young women, commonly just known as the Fox sisters. But they believed that there was basically something haunting their family home and quickly realized they could make pretty good money off of either having people over or somehow communicating with spirits in other venues. And then that became an attraction and sort of a form of entertainment that hopped across the Atlantic and ultimately landed in Europe. But that is interesting. I mean, I think you can't deny that there is some sort of connection between the entertainment element of seances and public displays of mediumship and the various substances and liquors and what have you that people would be enjoying while attending such events that probably made the experience more interesting and possibly more believable.
It is definitely interesting because you have this tonal shift throughout each century. So in the Georgian era, for instance, witchcraft was not considered necessarily a sin in the way that it was in the 17th century. The witch trials had really come to a close quite, I'd say, kind of early 1700s, and we have the rise of the Enlightenment coming along, and the idea of science, and how actually magic is just another name for something else, for a different belief system. Certainly near the end of the 18th century, there was a complete fascination for the occult, and it wasn't necessarily frowned down upon in the way that it was a century before that. But in the Victorian era, it suddenly became extremely popular and a bit of fun. Again, it's not frowned upon then either. It's something, that is essentially an entertainment for many. Sarah, obviously you've done the research and you'll know a bit more than that. But I do know in the Georgian era, there wasn't any particular fear, I think, behind the occult in the way that there have been in centuries before it. They just more kind of focused on science. And obviously you have the Industrial Revolution and everything kind of slowly turning to a more logical mindset. I mean, you have in the country and in Wales, where I am, for instance, you have the old herbal remedies and you have the old superstitions, but there were nothing to be necessarily afraid of. Mm-hmm. They were more revered and generally respected, and just something to be aware of rather than anything else. And then, like I said, you have that tonal shift into the Victorian era when it's a massive thing that was marketable almost. I will say, in terms of your question, Barbara, the Georgians, they tended to rely a lot on laudanum, which had the trace of the poppy seed in it, and then there was that shift from laudanum to opium specifically. But I think there is definitely an argument there to be said that, the poppy seed as a drug definitely caused some sort of mental kind of breakdown.
It's an altered state. Yeah. I mean, it isn't just pain treatment or oblivion. It's an altered state. I looked it up. As Thomas de Quincey is who I was trying to remember.
De Quincey, that's it. Yeah.
Yes. So Sarah, since you've read Sarah's book, why don't I just be quiet? Sarah, you read Susan's book. Why don't I be quiet and you talk to her about Pandora?
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought would maybe be useful for this discussion is obviously when we talk about fiction and we have our story, but there's always something bigger than the story, and kind of these themes that are overlaid on top of the plot and the characters. And so I'm curious, Susan, what you would consider a couple of the main themes running through Pandora, and why you decided to write a story about those themes.
Sure. Well, I think we have to address the fact that this was, even though it is a loose retelling, it is still essentially a reinterpretation, a retelling of the Greek myth Pandora's Box. And obviously Greek myth is a massive craze at the moment. We're all going crazy for it. And I think whether we're a classicist or not, I think we can all agree that in Greek myth, they're very misogynistic tales. Women are either written as the victim or the villain. Pandora, the mythical Pandora herself, her curiosity by opening the box is considered a sin. And I thought that quite unfair. And why should curiosity be interpreted in such a way? So we all know the general principle. Zeus gives the first woman, Pandora, a box, told never to open it. She opens it. All the sins of the world come out. She slams it shut and hope remains. So for my novel, I wanted to kind of readdress the balance on that. And I wanted to give my Dora, who is a loose, iteration of the mythical Pandora, that agency. I wanted to make her a strong woman. I wanted to make her the hero of her own story, to celebrate her curiosity, because in every single point of the novel, it is Dora who is calling the shots, and she is the one that is essentially the catalyst towards everything. Now, obviously, we have good male characters as well, as and there are some bad male characters, and there's even a couple of questionable female characters. They are all very selfish in their own way, Dora included, actually. But the novel does touch on all of essentially the deadly sins that the Pandora's box, you know, kind of opened up onto the world. But there's also that underlying element of hope, I hope, that connects everything all together. But I think my main idea was for this to be a novel that celebrated the strength and the virtues of women in many ways, and that could be a triumphant thing. And as I said, Dora would be the heroine of her own story, essentially. That was something I was very keen to kind of get across.
I absolutely love that, particularly because I feel like historical fiction is finally, over the last 5-10 years, we've seen so much historical fiction that's placing women front and center. And some of that is biographical in nature and telling the stories of real women who lived, and kind of fictionalizing the narrative around them where we don't have information about what their life might have been like. But that's been something that's been really refreshing. And I'm sure you've seen that too, Susan, and your various peers in the UK who are writing historical fiction, that a lot of stories nowadays seem to really put women and their decisions and their agency front and center.
Yeah. I love for your novel how you do have these two strong female characters, as very much you did with The Lost Apothecary.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about how you developed this strong female bond that you have between them, and essentially why you wanted to revisit the female bond, and also how is it potentially different from the bond that you explored with your two leads in The Lost Apothecary?
Mm-hmm. So it's funny, there are a couple of similarities in the relationships between women in my two books, and then there are obviously some differences. Something that happened almost without my even noticing it is this relationship that is a teacher and a student, or another, you may say teacher and apprentice. So in The Lost Apothecary, of course, that's Nella, the apothecary, and then she has young Eliza, who is an apprentice of sorts. And then in the London Seance Society, we see Lena trying to learn the art of seance from this world-renowned spiritualist. And I didn't really realize until I was fairly underway with my second book that I had gone down this same path of having a young woman sort of looking up to a more experienced woman. And I've tried to do some introspective soul searching and ask myself if there's something inside of me that is triggering this. And I really can't come up with anything, except that I love the idea of, in both of my stories, women banding together and helping one another. And sometimes help comes in the form of teaching and instruction. And I think that, and you probably resonate with this too, Susan, at a certain point in a new writer's career, you have to kind of sit down and say, what do I envision my brand as? And what do my readers want from me next? And what's kind of going to be my ongoing brand? And I knew pretty early on, I want to feature strong women who are banding together and sometimes acting in rebellious, subversive ways. And so I think that in both of my stories, we find women kind of in precarious situations and having to use their ingenuity to work themselves out. But it's been fun. And there are so many opportunities for story ideas around that, and women who are helping one another. So, and I mean, I'm working on my third book now, and I definitely want to ask you more about what's next for you. But I don't have, in this third book I'm working on, I don't really have a teacher-student relationship again. Okay. But there are certainly plenty of elements of women banding together and supporting one another.
Just a kind of side kind of comment there. I love your character names for this one. They're inspired. They're just really striking, I think, or, you know, visually, and the way that they sound as well. They just kind of flow off the tongue. I think they're brilliant. Where did they come from? Were they inspired by any real life ones, or was it just a kind of little genius spark that happened in your head?
So Vaudeline was a name that I came across during some of my research into well-known spiritualists who lived during the 1870s. And I thought that was just such an elegant French name. So she was easy. And she's got a French last name as well, Dialaire. So I think that's how she came about. Lina, that the origin of the name Lina means lion's heart. And
Oh, wow.
I never actually put that in the book. I think maybe it was in an early draft and then I nixed it, but I know what it means. But I always just viewed her as kind of lion-hearted. She can be a little temperamental, certainly rebellious, and I really liked that name as well. And it's funny because my apothecary in the Lost Apothecary, her name is Nella, and someone on my team asked me, Nella, Lena, like, did you know you used the same letters? Was that purposeful?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I said, no, it just was total coincidence that it happened. So what about you? How did you come up with your character names?
Well, Dora Blake was obviously going to be, Pandora, but I didn't want there to be a kind of blatant, there was too many words, kind of times I used the word Pandora. So my version of Pandora still had to kind of be individual in her own right. Blake was inspired by William Blake, who was a famous poet in the Georgian era, so that had to happen. Edward Lawrence just simply popped up. I just think it felt like a very natural name to do. But my favorite character and my favorite name is actually Cornelius Ashmole. Cornelius, again, I'm not too sure where Cornelius came from, but Ashmole, that was a little kind of my own Easter egg, because in Lichfield, where, as I said, where I grew up, there was a man named Elias Ashmole, and he was born and lived in Lichfield for a very long time. But he was actually the founder of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where many kind of antiques are kept. He was also a member of the Society of Antiquaries, which is what I talk about quite a bit in the novel as well. So I tended to kind of look at names that actually existed in the era, like you, Sarah, and kind of just pull inspiration from those and kind of just do a bit of a kind of kind of little kind of patchwork quilt element there. But I love kind of looking through old names and looking at old texts as well. And some of the names are so unusual. There was one that Emily Brand, who's an historical Georgian historian, she does a lot of archive research, and some of the names that she's picked out are absolutely hilarious. And I'm definitely going to take one of those at some point.
And how about the magpie? Remind me the bird's name, and how did the bird become a character in your story?
Well, the idea for Dora and Hermes themselves, they did genuinely just pop into my head fully formed. I will say that Hermes was not named Hermes to begin with. He was actually named Marius.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that name at some point, I think, probably book 3. But my editor very rightly questioned, when we were kind of near the end of the structural edits, you've got all these kind of Greek references. Why on earth have you chosen the word Marius when Dora herself is half Greek? Why? And I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't know why I did that. I just like the name. So I had to then think about what name would actually suit this magpie. And I kind of looked up all the Greek names of the gods and the goddesses. And I thought, there we go, Hermes, because Hermes was the god of mischief and the god of thieves. And he was also a messenger for the gods. So it kind of, that just suited the novel, because without giving too much away, Hermes does have a key role. And if you consider what that role is and what those names represent, it made sense. Yeah. And
I think the early draft that I read, his name was still Marius.
Yes.
And Hermes happened later. But I love that. That's such a fitting name given all the things that unfold during the story.
Yeah.
So tell me this, because, Dora, among her other virtues, is trying to be a professional woman. Why did you decide to make her a jewelry designer, which I thought was wonderful?
Oh, I think that was probably a subconscious decision, to be perfectly honest. I've always loved my antique jewelry. I'm wearing a few now. again, that was just part of the character element that came fully formed in my mind. I've always loved antique jewelry myself, and I thought that would be quite fun. I wanted her to be creative. I wanted to have some sort of hobby that was also realistic in the sense to the situation that she was in herself, because she doesn't have a lot of money. Well, she has no money, let's be honest. She has no money. She's living essentially in poverty in the antiquity shop that used to belong to her parents, and she is trying to find a way to escape. And I thought there's only one way that she could potentially do that, and that is to draw and to kind of have this dream that would take her beyond the confines of the situation she has found herself. And it to me, it was just something I thought I could make that work.
Yeah, well, it seemed to me that women were allowed to be creative in a different way than they were not really allowed to go into trade, for example, the whole shopkeeper thing. But, if she were a creative person designing jewelry, or there were women who did silversmithing, I think, and other stuff, then that was okay. There was a sort of cachet about being creative that was different than if you were, earning money the typewriter had a lot to do with allowing women to become, professional in a different way, but you're a century away from that. Right. Remember in Dorothy Sayers, there's a whole pool of ladies who use their typewriter. They're in secretarial school. So that became a thing. And you're before that. I don't think we've mentioned how much fun Pandora is, because Elizabeth Peters, for those of you who've read her, she really wrote what one could describe as romps in a way. They were just lots of fun. There would be a quest, there would be a treasure, there would be romance, so Pandora is really a lot of fun.
It is. I did have a lot of fun writing it, and while it is definitely Gothic fiction, I think it's more on the lighter side of Gothic fiction. Whereas what I'm currently writing at the moment is a lot darker. So like you, Sarah, I decided that I wanted to kind of do something. When I say it is slightly different, but again, like yours, Sarah, that there are echoing elements there. I think there's almost like this typeset. I think potentially both of us have gone down with the second novels, and the third, like your third, moves away from that somewhat. So it is interesting, but I knew from my debut I wanted to have it something that would still show. Well, I'm always going to write in the Georgian era. That is a given. I don't see myself changing. But the Georgian era is such a vast period of history. It's 1714 through to the 1830s. I've got plenty to play with, so I'm not too worried about that. So, but you can typecast me, I suppose, as a Georgian writer, but some of them probably going to be darker than others. And I didn't think as a debut it was best to start off with quite a dark novel. I think there needed to be lightness and some fun.
What else can you tell us about this second novel that you're working on?
Right. Well, we're hoping to announce the title within the next couple of weeks. What I can say is that it is set in 1780s Wales. So it's the area that I'm living now. It's a rural place. So we're completely straying from Georgian London. We're now in rural Georgian Snowdonia. So a very, very different kind of setting. But there'll be a male character and a female character. So again, we have that kind of echo of the two different sexes in the lead. And as a very, very brief premise, it's about a doctor who has been fired from his previous job for reasons currently unknown and sent to the backwaters of Wales to take over a position that's become vacant. And what he finds there essentially is a place full of myth and superstition and some funny kind of odd goings on that don't quite add up. So,
well, what could
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, the Mabinogion, all that wonderful legend.
Exactly. Yeah, it's also, I am going to try and lean in as much to the Welsh myth as possible, but I'm also exploring elements of the occult and the Hellfire clubs that were prevalent in the era as well. So it's a bit of a mix.
And are you still editing, Susan?
I am. Yes. Okay. So we're I had trouble with this one. This is my tricky second novel, and I'm very envious that you've managed to whack yours out so fast. But mine has been a bit of a devil. But we can finally see the wood for the trees now. So fingers crossed it kind of continues that way.
That's great. There will come a day where you are done with it, and I hope, will be celebrating.
Thank heaven. And what about you? Oh, sorry, Bob.
I was just going to say, what about Sarah's book? Same question you were asking.
Same question, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm working on my third book. It's due to my editor at the end of the year. So I've got about, I guess, 8 months. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through the first draft. And it is not set in London. So I knew that if I wrote a third book set in the really mysterious, atmospheric old alleyways of London, I was worried I might be pigeonholing myself, and that would be what readers come to expect from me forever. So I decided to write something set elsewhere. And this book takes place on the Amalfi Coast in Italy. And it is dual timeline, similar to The Lost Apothecary. So we've got a present day narrator. She is a marine archaeologist and a very advanced scuba diver. And she is on a project off of the Amalfi coastline, and she investigates this area that's riddled with mysterious shipwrecks. And the historical timeline takes place in 1814, and it's when Positano in Italy was just a very quaint, almost unheard of fishing village. And there is a coven of witches who live in the village, and they have power over the sea. And there is essentially, they leave behind a legend about what may have been causing some of these shipwrecks. So we see how these two stories ultimately intertwine. So I'm really excited about the book. My husband and I are scuba divers. We've gone diving in many a shipwreck in the Florida Keys. So I'm having a lot of fun with writing some of the underwater scenes. I think it's going to be my longest book yet. It's certainly my most ambitious in terms of research. And of course, we also have the added complication that I don't know Italian. So I am, and of course, my characters are mostly Italian. So I'm reading right now the book Loyalty by Lisa Scottolini that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And her whole story takes place in Sicily. And I'm reassured that she's by what she's doing, because of course, most of the book is written in English. And then she just occasionally, like a little dash of salt and pepper, will throw in an Italian word within context so the reader can understand what it means.
Yeah.
So I'm very excited about this next book. And I'm particularly excited to have the first draft done, because I've been on tour for a bit now and I haven't been able to work on it for a few weeks. So I look forward to getting through the first draft.
It's definitely a link to Lisa's book launch, which we did with Hank Philippi Ryan, when she talks about some things that I think might be of interest to you.
Okay.
So you both talked about the word, or both mentioned the word Gothic, which I said a couple of years ago was going to be the next big thing, and sure enough, it is. What do you mean by Gothic? Susan, what do you think Gothic means? I mean, it's such a big word, but all of a sudden it's cropping up in ways that I am not really sure are appropriate. As becoming a buzzword.
Well, the thing is, I wouldn't personally say it's popping up. I think Gothic fiction has been around for a very, very long time. It actually goes way back into the Georgian period, where you have the Castle of Otranto, and then, of course, you have that very epic Few Nights Away with Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and Polidori, who wrote The Vampire, or The Vampire, if you want to be pedantic about it, which Byron then stole and kind of published it essentially under his own name. But the whole kind of Gothic craze, I think, probably started from that, and it tends to kind of dip and flow, and it rises in popularity and then disappears off a little bit for a few years, but it never completely goes away. I think, I mean, you've also got The Woman in Black, you know, that's one of the key, Gothic pieces. where, you know, you have the typical standard, it's that there's a ghost, there's very definitely an entity there. You have such novels as Turn of the Screw as well, which has a similar sort of vein. But then you also have novels such as Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, where you have the element of Gothic. And I think generally Gothic, for me, the way I'd interpret it is very much atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily have to be a ghost there. You just have that feeling of foreboding, the macabre. But there are various different ways to interpret the Gothic. You know, you've got Mexican Gothic, which is, a lot more modern set, obviously, than the Castle of Otranto. It's a difficult one because I think the definition of it is so broad in terms of range. But I think if we kind of generally connect the obvious tropes, so a dark and dreary place, a mysterious event or kind of past that is happening, a ghost potentially, the darkness of one's heart, which could either be, it could be metaphorical, it could be physical, that there is the darkness of a personality of a person or a physical creature. So I think it's just very much a grey sort of area that many novels can lean into, but it never ever goes away, not completely.
I didn't ask my question very well. What I meant to say was not that there haven't been Gothic. No, it was totally my fault. What I meant to say is that critics and reviewers are peppering the word Gothic in places where I don't think it necessarily belongs. So I'm just, I'm constantly, it's like locked room is being used today in a way that it isn't what it means. People are describing the Agatha Christie closed house structure as a locked room mystery, which is not a locked room mystery. So Sarah, what do you think about Gothic?
I mean, to your second part of your question just there, I think that critics and publishers and the way that you package books in general, or for critics who are trying to get clicks on their reviews, I think that a lot of the language that's used in back cover copy or in some of these reviews is to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt. I think Gothic is a bit of a buzzword. When I hear the word Gothic, just the one word that comes to mind is dark. That can mean, as Susan was saying, atmosphere. That can mean the relationships at the heart of the story. Maybe a villainous character. I personally picture like a gorgeous old Gothic mansion with gargoyles and black lace drapery. But I think, to your point, Barbara, sometimes we do see these words. I know there are mysteries that take place on islands and they call it a locked room because you can't leave the island. So I think you have to sort of read the description and the premise of the book as well to figure out if you as a reader are interested in what that book is described as.
I think you're right. I think it can lead readers to books that they may not like if, the buzzword is wrong. I like foreboding. I think there's always that sort of brooding or, atmosphere. There doesn't even have to be a murder in Gothic. People somehow or other have decided that, mystery means there's a murder, but that's totally not true. I mean, Dorothy Sayers wrote some great short stories in which there was never a murder. It was like about wine or other things. It's a very broad umbrella, which is why I call it crime fiction, because, it I think spreads out. Why don't we call Ian up and see if there are any questions from the audience? He's lurking there. Speak about foreboding. There he is.
Yes. One of the viewers just had a comment that they learned about mudlarking from Sarah.
Yeah, mudlarking. So for anyone listening who doesn't know what this is, it essentially means scrounging around along a body of water in the mud or sand, looking for valuable or historical artifacts. And it's a very popular pastime in central London along the River Thames. I first came across mudlarking probably 7 or so years ago. My mother-in-law gifted me a book for Christmas that had mostly images and descriptions of things this one mudlarker had found. And there are several very well-known mudlarkers on Instagram that I started following. And I decided when writing The Lost Apothecary, which is dual timeline. And so our present day character, she finds her first clue in the river while mudlarking. And I purposely did that because a lot of dual timeline historical mysteries begin with kind of looking in grandma's diary or someone going to the attic and looking through a box or maybe an old library. And those are all really beautiful story introductions. But I wanted to do something different. And I had just learned about and started following a lot of mudlarkers online. So I decided she was going to find a vial in the river. And I'm asked often if I've gone mudlarking. The answer is yes. Several years ago, I purchased a permit from the Port of London Authority, and I put on my tennis shoes and plastic gloves and went down to the riverbed on 2 separate days and went mudlarking. And I think it's a great alternative to going to some of the museums in central London. I mean, I was able to be outside kind of looking through things on my own. I did not find any apothecary vials, but it was a very fun experience. And actually the paperback of my book has a mudlarking 101 guide for anybody who's interested in going themselves.
For the both of you, what are some challenges that you face in writing historical fiction?
I think with historical fiction, you do have the ability to use creative license. But I think for me personally, if the facts are there, if you have the record and it is set in stone, for me, it is trying to work around that and being respectful to it and using it in some way. And sometimes the story that you want to tell won't necessarily always fit the facts that are there. At the back of Pandora, I have an author's note, and on the rare occasions I have diverted away from the original source material, I have said so. But I think with historical fiction, you have that ability to ask why or what or how and fill in the gaps. And even if you are using the original source material, that can be a challenge in itself, because you have to then think about how realistic would this be? How can I stay true to the era and the actual, it's essentially the historical kind of limits of the time, especially for women. So Dora herself, as I mentioned earlier to Barbara, I needed to give Dora a hobby where it was a realistic one that she could carry out, sketching in her bedroom. Now, there aren't any obvious records of there being a female jewelry designer who sold designs to the upper classes, but it's not impossible because there's no kind of specific record saying this didn't happen. But at the same time, I needed there to be characters like Edward who could help her along the way, because, as I said, she's trapped in her uncle's house. She is a girl with no money, no prospects, no connections, and so she couldn't just stay in this attic room twiddling her thumbs and hope a miracle would happen. I had to allow her to be guided, so that would help me breach the limitations that were already set in place to her in a society sort of setting. So it can be tricky to try and get that fine balance, and it doesn't always work. So when it doesn't work, that's when you have to kind of note when it's not worked in the author's note. I think that is very, very important.
Yeah, I think Susan summed it up beautifully, but I faced a similar challenge with my 20-something character named Lena in the London Seance Society. She should be working in the family home with her family owns a hotel, and instead we find her traveling to Paris by herself, which is pretty much unheard of in that time frame, but I had to find a way to make it happen. So it's taking that extra time to sort of think under what circumstances might this have been plausible, whether it's with her father's support, or he accompanies her, or he funds her, or whatever. So there were various societal restrictions that especially women, like Susan said, had to face in these different eras, but you can't necessarily build out your story set in the drawing room of a house. They've got to get outside and make things happen and live their lives in order to have a compelling story. So sometimes you have to just stretch plausibility a little bit and do the best that you can. And certainly some readers will come through and say that would have never happened, or why did you write something so anachronistic? And my response to questions like that is I had to tell a story. Like, yes, sometimes as a reader, you do have to suspend your belief a little bit. But I think that as long as you take the time to present it to the reader in the best way that you can, and then, like Susan said, any deviations you can also justify in your author's note, and then you aren't held accountable at that point because you've just admitted outright the liberties that you've taken.
Yeah.
Excellent
It's
point.
historical. I was going to say it's historical fiction. It's fiction at the end of the day, so we can have a bit of a play.
I'm going to recommend a book that I just read by Diane Biller called Hotel of Secrets, which takes place in Imperial Vienna in the 19th century. And she has found a really novel way of giving her female character agency because she's running a hotel. The women in her family have run this hotel, which is down on its luck. And so she's trying to work out a way to bring it back. And it's really fun. It's also slightly implausible, but at the same time, as you point out, it's fiction. So
Right.
Why not enjoy it? Anything else there, Ian?
One final question for the both of you. How do you balance your writing and editing with promoting your novels and your personal life?
I think Sarah needs to take this one first.
Gosh, how do I balance? Well, at the present moment, I'm not. It's just chaos. So I just returned home last night from this 2-week tour I've been doing, and I spent every night for 14 days in a different hotel. That's part of why you see me here in gym clothes and no makeup, is because I've kind of reached the point where just whatever I can offer is what I'm giving you. And this is what I can offer today. So how do I balance it? The social media is just kind of, I post on the go when I can. I take pictures of what I'm doing or what I'm reading. That seems to work out fine. The writing, I haven't touched my manuscript in almost 3 weeks. I will open that document up tomorrow and get back at it. So it's not always a good balance, but you do the best that you can.
Yeah. It's slightly easier for me at the moment because I'm in the middle of writing instructional edits. I specifically asked my publicist to pare back on the events for the paperback release of Pandora here in the UK. But last year, when the hardback came out in the UK, it was absolutely manic. And like Sarah, I don't think I managed to look at my manuscript for quite a number of weeks. I had to push a couple of deadlines back because I just wasn't finding the time. I had 10 days where I was on the road and just with a different hotel every night. And with the best will in the world, I took my laptop with me to try and attempt something, but it never, ever happened. It takes a lot out of you. And it's such a pleasure to be able to meet readers and chat to them, and the fact that they come and they've bought your book, you want to give them that completely dedicated attention. But at the same time, it does mean that you're absolutely shattered by the time you get back to the hotel. So there was just no way I was going to get any writing done. I don't have a partner, so I don't have to worry about giving my partner attention. I can very much kind of come back and settle in and just get on with things. But I am also a bit of a carer to my mother as well. So I do have to kind of try and balance out as much of the time as possible. It's not always easy, but in this so-called quiet spell at the moment where I don't have any publicity, it is much, much easier to manage. But yeah, it's hit and miss and completely depends on the author's schedule.
So 33 years ago, when I started the Poison Pen, in a more genteel age, should we say, publishers actually did, publicists did an enormous amount of the work that now authors are expected to do. To have a successful publishing career. I talked to Harlan Coben about this at some length last Monday, because he began as the paperback original author and became a star to a great degree, not only for his books, but putting himself out there and, creating a personality that made Lisa Scottolini is very good at that too. And Hank Philippi Ryan, people, and I think the shift has been pretty dramatic to the author. It's hard not to do that. I'm going to end with a final message for you two, which I think is kind of interesting. The next big thing, believe it or not, which I've just realized since I've done 6 of these books in the last 2.5 months, is female rage and female serial killers have suddenly come to the fore. Most interesting are the identical triplet serial killers set here in Arizona. That was an event I did last week. And, you're talking about women finding agency to, that particular line. Anyway, in some way, trying to shape their own lives and take command of them. But all of a sudden, it's being taken in very contemporary crime fiction to a level that I must say is really surprising. I haven't even figured out how to talk about it. I really don't know. But
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, I mean, how I'll kill you is the the triplets, and yet it really has some very interesting moral themes, since themes are something that interest you both, and it's not as bizarre in the end as you might think, but you have to read your way all the way through the book to arrive at the place where you can make some decisions about whether it's believable, whether you sympathize, whatever. But I do think there's a whole cross-genre thing going on too, where you can put things into books. They don't have to be rigidly defined. That's one reason I like Gothic. You've already said it's a very inclusive, very expansive at the same time, very protean form, which I love. So thank you both for spending time. Susan, it is a paperback here in the United States. I don't remember that I looked it up, but I don't recall there was a hardcover release here.
Unfortunately, no. But the paperback has been produced, beautifully. So I am very, very happy with the fact that it's even overseas with you guys in the first place. But no, it is just paperback over with you, and the hardback and paperback is here in the UK.
Well, no, I didn't mean just. It was.
Oh, no.
It came to my attention sort of by I'm not even sure how, because most of the time it's difficult to allot a lot of time to promoting a paperback for a bookstore because there's not as much money in it. And I don't know whether it was the cover, whether it was the title, whether Sarah said something. I have no idea. But I'm really delighted that I did find it, and I truly recommend it. It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure. I will look forward to the next one. Darker. Ooh, Wales. Hey. Anyway, thanks very much, ladies. It was a real pleasure talking to you. Try to enjoy some downtime, Sarah, before you have to start it again.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all so much. This was great.
Thank you.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.